Wow, that was pretty good. We're going to record Jeff Goldberg, you, and we're going to get the applause and figure out who gets the most. And thank you for, as I said, courage and bravery being the theme, but serving the country. And thanks. I want to start with sort of something that jangles in my mind, which is you famously won the Robert F. Kennedy Spirit of Liberty Award. And then you got Robert F. Kennedy Jr. calling you a liar and writing a whole book denouncing you. Your memoir is great, but how did growing up in Brooklyn with a Jesuit education prepare you for that dichotomy?
Yeah, well, that sort of belies the saying, like father, like son, for sure. Well, Walter, as we discussed before, I guess it's a question of resiliency. It's really unfortunate what's going on right now, but you were saying, how does growing up in Brooklyn and having a Jesuit education, which is founded on service for others and integrity and honesty, just develop the approach to life of focusing on what is important, what your mission is, and as a scientist and a physician is to do whatever I can to preserve and protect the health of the American public. And since the United States is such a leader in health and science, perhaps to have an impact on the world. Everything else and the things that are going on right now with the anti-science approach is really very unfortunate and is going to have implications, negative implications, far beyond what people are realizing.
Well, how did you prevent from letting it get you down?
Well,
there's a phrase at Regis High School.
Yeah, a Jesuit priest in Regis High School when I was a first-year student, thinking that all of this work that we had to do studying Latin and Greek was overcoming us. He told me one day, illegitimi non carborundum, which means don't let the bastards wear you down.
And so you've been using that as your... Yeah. It's actually under the pelican, right up top. That's the Latin motto. Yeah, exactly. And you worked for your father as a pharmacist. One of the things we biographers think about is all about Dad, but you were delivering medicines. How did that shape what you wanted to do?
Well, I didn't realize it at the time, Walter, but my father, who had a pharmacy in the working class Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn, New York, in the 1940s and early 1950s, was very different than the industrial pharmacies of today, the CVS's and the Walgreens. And that was sort of like the hub of the community help center, where you were, besides giving prescriptions, you were a marriage counselor, you were advising people who had delinquent children, and in the neighborhood I grew up in, that was not an uncommon thing. So I was instilled with, even though I didn't consciously realize it, how important service to the community was, because he really cared a lot about the neighborhood, and he did whatever he could to make it a better place in a very unselfish way. It was not a good business model. We certainly didn't make a lot of money because many people were poor enough that they couldn't pay for the prescriptions, and he very generously would say, well, don't worry about it, we'll put that on a tab and you could pay it later. Sometimes they would never get to paying it. So even as young as 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, I was imbued with that feeling of it's important for service to others. That got really underscored and amplified as I went into my 8 years of Jesuit training in high school and in college, where the theme of the Jesuit training is always service for others. It was an all-boys school, so at the time it was men for others, but right now it's people for others. And you worry about taking care of others and doing whatever you can, and that's kind of shaped my entire professional and in many respects.
And just to save the honor of the pelican, it actually says not for oneself, but for one's own, which is that same theme.
Right.
The humanities and the classics and Greek, you really were into that. To what extent is a connection, as we try to do at Tulane, between humanities and sciences, is that important?
Yeah, people often ask that because if you look at the courses I took in in high school were the preparation for college. It was very heavily weighted in the classics and the humanity. Certainly we had science, but science was not the dominant theme. It was mostly the humanities and the classics. When I went to college, I had a very interesting course definition. It was Bachelor of Arts, Greek classics / philosophy - pre-med, which is almost oxymoronic, where they gave us just enough science to get into medical school, but the core was people as the core of what you do. And it really shaped how I looked at science and medicine. I mean, obviously, fundamental basic science is core to everything that we do, that I've done in my career, but it has always been with the major theme is for humanity's sake. So I think those 8 years of training, going all the way back, as you alluded to, Walter, from when I was a child of 7, 8, 9 years old, with my family, that had the theme of what I do being it's important. So I think of medicine and science as a person who has a disease as opposed to a disease that's afflicting a person. And I think when you take that attitude, it gives you a different perspective on medicine and science.
So you progressed into public service in that whole arena under the National Institutes of Health, which I know Francis Collins, who was your friend and partner doing that.
For decades.
For decades, yeah. And then you were running infectious diseases, the institute there. Why did you choose, how did you get into that path rather than becoming a doctor or a researcher for the rest of your life?
Well, I think it's a reflection of what I tell students when I have the privilege and opportunity to deal with them, is the lack of linearity in one's career arc. Because when I went to medical school, I was absolutely convinced that what I wanted to do was to get through medical school, do a few years of residency, get a specialized fellowship, and go back to where I began my training in New York City at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center, and practice medicine. I knew exactly where I wanted to do it, on 71st Street and First Avenue in New York City. But what happened was that there was something, a little turn in the road when I went down to the NIH to do a fellowship in a combination of infectious diseases and immunology. I became aware of the beautiful potential of biomedical research, which I call kind of the amplifying effect. Whereas you can go into a room and have a major impact on the individual patient that you're taking care of. But if you can make a discovery or create a clinical protocol that would have the amplifying effect of not only the patient that you're taking care of, but perhaps tens and hundreds and thousands of patients. And that's when I decided that instead of wanting to go back to New York City and practice medicine, I wanted to stay at the NIH and do fundamental, basic, and clinical research. And I did that for 54 years. So,
well, you know, that was a fundamental... That was a fundamental tenet of post-war, meaning World War II America, was you had research that was funded through the federal government. Vannevar Bush starts the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, using great academies, whether it be New York University or Tulane, for the research, and then dealing with private industry. Are you afraid that's being ripped apart now by stopping these government grants?
I'm terrified of that, and I don't, that's not hyperbole, Walter. What's going on right now appears to be an indiscriminate discontinuation of programs that have already proven to be life-saving. Whether it's a program of HIV prevention or whether it's a program of the development of vaccines, which of all of the medical interventions, if you were to rank what they are, vaccines are unquestionably right up there among the most important life-saving. And if you look at what's happening, right now, it seems to be almost a diabolical across-the-board cutting of things that are related to the prevention of disease and the treatment of disease. I just hope that doesn't continue, and I hope somehow people realize that that is going down the wrong pathway. Because if you look at what biomedical research, I mean, obviously, Francis Collins and I have been at the NIH for a very long period of time. The NIH is, among other institutions, one of the most important. It certainly is the largest and most impactful biomedical research organization in the world, in history. And if you're starting to systematically take it apart, that is not going to be good for mankind, that's for sure. So
no, if the enemy wanted to undermine our nation, the first thing I think they would be doing would be forcing you to cut the basic research that leads to everything.
Well, there are a number of things that the United States is unquestionably a world leader in. Two of them are in biomedical research and the universities. And it seems diabolically both of those things appear to be under attack right now.
You say there's sort of across-the-board cuts, but something really weird in the cuts at NIH in particular is their keyword searches, where if you even mention a word like diversity, of course, or some, that the grant is over.
Right.
Tell me about what that's.
Or vaccine hesitancy, or other.
In other words, if you put vaccine
hesitancy, you're out. You can't do that, and a number of other things. Obviously, we're all aware of the DEI that's been kicked out, but there are a lot of other very important words that really have been essentially canceled, which is really unfortunate and very paradoxical, because you hear that one of the complaints was that the scientific community was censoring opposing opinions, which when you examine it carefully, it wasn't censoring opposing opinions. It was saying that if you have an opposing opinion, it should be based on data and evidence, not just on your opinion.
Let me take one. Let me take one word that we've talked about that I've heard is a flag when the people from Doge or whatever are looking through all the grants, which is the four letters mRNA.
Right.
And having, you've studied that. Explain what messenger RNA can do for vaccines and cancer, and why being a denier of that is so weird.
Well, mRNA is a vaccine platform. A vaccine platform means it's one of the ways that you can deliver a particular immunogen, whether that's an immunogen that would protect you against polio or measles or COVID or HIV, or even in cancer therapy. The development of mRNA as a highly flexible, adaptable mechanism of delivering an immunogen was one of the most important scientific advances in the last several decades, and in fact won the Nobel Prize just last year for Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman. So there's no doubt that it is an extraordinarily important platform for vaccines, as well as the delivery of other important interventions. The problem is, in the arena that we appear to be living in, of disinformation and untruths, there was this theme out there that the mRNA vaccines were causing more deaths than COVID, which is utterly outlandish, because if you look at the data of the billions of people who have received vaccination, life-saving vaccination for COVID, people who are unvaccinated have a hospitalization and death rate like that. People who are vaccinated, it's down like that. So the data, as we were talking about opinion versus data, the data are overwhelming for the life-saving capability of mRNA vaccines.
People think, the people who are against mRNA vaccines, think it goes in and it changes your DNA and takes over. As we have a lot of Oxford people. You met some last
Yes.
night, the head of research. And I did the clinical trials there for the Pfizer mRNA before it was approved. But it was pretty simple.
Right.
The RNA doesn't go into the interior of your cell.
Well, that gets back to what we were saying about opinion versus data. There is no molecular mechanism that would allow that to happen. So what are you talking about?
Yeah. You know, when you were at the NIH, and I think when we first met, because I was a young reporter at the time, you noticed a spike in deaths, a small spike, and it just started, of gay men. What was that, July of 80?
June and then July of 81.
Right. I had just joined Time. We put it on the cover. You were important. But tell me about seeing that spike, and why did you figure something out?
Well, you know, again, Walter, that gets back to what I talk about, the lack of linearity in one's career, because at the time, I was on a very successful track of developing therapeutic protocols for auto-inflammatory diseases, and we were doing very well. I was on a good career trajectory from 1972 to 81. In 1981, in June of 81, I noted on a publication that comes out every week from the CDC called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, a very unusual report. The Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report is kind of a surveillance. They say, well, you know, a food poisoning in Minnesota or 5 cases of this in New Mexico. This was 5 young, previously healthy, curiously gay men from Los Angeles who presented with a very unusual pneumonia called pneumocystis, which you only see in people who are immune compromised. When I read it, I thought it was a fluke, to be honest with you, in all transparency. I thought it was some drugs, some poppers that they were taking to enhance sexual satisfaction, and I thought it would just go away. 1 month later, in July of 1981, another MMWR appeared on my desk. This time, 26, no longer curiously, but amazingly, all young, previously healthy gay men, not only from LA, but now from San Francisco and New York, who were presenting with this strange pneumonia, plus a whole host of opportunistic infections that you only see in immune-compromised people, and a strange cancer called Kaposi sarcoma. That MMWR, and I say that without exaggeration, Walter, changed my life, because it just literally spurred me on to say, I'm going to change the direction of my career. And even though I was on a pretty good pathway, I turned around my lab, handed over what I was doing successfully to trainees that had been with me for a few years, and devoted all my attention to admitting, taking care of, and hopefully getting some research insight into this strange disease. And I did that in the fall and winter of 1981. And that was 44 years ago. And what has happened since then has been the arc of my career, because I have still right now, consider myself someone whose major interest is in immune compromising, particularly HIV. But just to add one aspect to it that people need to appreciate, related to the question you asked me about interfering with the research flow that has been so productive at the NIH, is that during those first years, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, were the dark years of my professional career, because I had been used to taking care of people with serious diseases that I developed protocols to make them better. So the theme was, you came in to see me thinking you were going to die, and we gave you the protocol that we developed, and we saved your life. Starting in 1981, when I began admitting to the NIH Clinical Center these desperately ill, young, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly young gay men, were the dark years of my career, because no matter what I did, they all died within 10 to 15 months with a terrible disease that devastated their community. What we did was turn on the engine of biomedical research, and year by year, first discovering the virus, developing a diagnostic test, developing first one drug that was slightly effective but not quite, then 2 drugs, and then a combination of drugs which, when put together in a single pill, to get a person who now can walk into an office and say, I was recently infected with HIV, I'm in my mid to late 20s, you can give that person a single pill once a day, and they could live a life which you could project accurately would be essentially a normal lifespan, except for maybe 1 or 2 years, which is one of the most important advances in biomedical research that literally
It was also very nonpartisan, whether it was, especially after Reagan, but with Bush and others and PEPFAR. But there was huge controversy. The attacks on you now are stronger, but the attacks on you were really bad back then from people like Larry Kramer and ACT UP, who just called you a murderer, that you weren't moving fast enough. Were you surprised by the attacks you got?
I was surprised until I listened to what they were saying. And now, back then, the community, which was mostly young gay men, there were some injection drug users and some other people in the community. But what was happening was that you had a disease that was very novel, and it was killing people within a period of a year or less of the time they became clinically ill. So the community was terribly frightened, were frustrated, and were trying to get the establishment, and when I say establishment, I mean the scientific establishment and the regulatory establishment, to get them to understand that what had been going on in the biomedical research community with very rigid entry and exclusion criteria in clinical trials, the lack of availability of drugs outside of the clinical trial, and the FDA, which was doing a great job in protecting the safety of the American public at the same time of getting drugs out, but the process would take 7 years. You know, and as Larry Kramer, the icon of activism, said, do the math. We're infected, we're gonna die in 12 to 15 months, and you're talking about an approval process that takes 7 to 10 years. So what they did is that they protested that the system wasn't working for them. I was a very visible person because I was one of the few people at the time that was full-time involved in HIV, and I was pushing the system to get more resources, which was one of the reasons why I accepted the job as NIAID director, because I wanted to get more resources for AIDS and infectious diseases. But what the activist community did when the scientific community didn't listen to them, and they said something, Walter, which in retrospect, thinking about it, may have been understandable, but was unacceptable. We, the scientific community, said, we know what's best for you. We'll do it this way. And they were saying, no, you don't know what's best for me. I'm the one that has the disease. So when the scientific community didn't listen to them, they started to become iconoclastic, disruptive, and theatrical. And since I was a known face, I became the face of the federal government. So that's when they started to attack me in the press. Larry Kramer, his iconic article in the San Francisco Examiner saying an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Calling you a murderer, right?
He called me a murderer. I call you a murderer. Well, he certainly got my attention. But what I did was I said to myself, wait a minute, these young people can't be wrong. Put aside the theatrics and listen to what they were saying. And what they were saying was making perfect sense, to the point that I was convinced that if I were in their shoes, I would be doing exactly what they were doing. I would be protesting, I would be shutting down Wall Street, I would be invading St. Patrick's Cathedral the way they did. So when I started to listen to what they say, it made perfect sense. So I said, now I've got to embrace them. And that was one of the best things that I've ever done in my career, was to bring them in, sit down with them and say, how can we work together to make the process work better for you without compromising the scientific process. So they were completely correct. And the subtext of your question was, how does that compare with the anti-science attacks on me and my colleagues now? It's, you say it's like apples and oranges. It's like peanuts and elephants difference, because they were correct. And what they were doing was based on an important need for change. What's going on now is the indiscriminate anti-science, anti-vax is totally different, because even though a person can have their opinion, they're going against all the available data, whereas the community back then was saying, let's take a look at what's going on right now and let's adapt ourselves to that process. So it's really very different.
There's a beautiful scene, sad scene in the book in which Larry Kramer is dying.
Yeah.
And he's called you a murderer, he's played your part, and he calls you and talks to you and he says, I love you, Tony.
Right.
And you had brought him around and you say, I love you, Larry.
Yeah.
And that reconciliation, because you had listened to him, do you see, I know you've talked about it in general about today, but do you see any path to reconciliation today?
I hope so, Walter, because Francis Collins, my dear friend and colleague, is actually starting to write about that right now, about how, we've got to believe that there are better angels in everyone, that there is some commonality of people really, despite what they're saying, which appears to be completely contrary to some of the things, that there has to be a common feeling that we're all much more alike than we are different. Because if you look at things now, the amount of divisiveness looks like we have like two separate tribes in this country that are very, very different from each other. And, in times of stress, we should have come together more than we did, particularly in COVID. And what happened was COVID, I think, exacerbated the divisiveness that was already in the country.
Well, part of that divisiveness was a feeling that the government and the elites were locking us down and things. Wasn't that somewhat of a mistake to do too many mass mandates and lockdowns when it went against people's individual freedoms?
Well, when you're dealing with a situation at the time, which was in March, when the coronavirus task force back then said what we really need to do, because there were about 4,000 deaths per day, and there were freezer trucks that were parked in front of many of the hospitals because so many people were dying of COVID that they couldn't fit them in the morgue. They had to put them in freezer trucks. That is a completely unprecedented emergency situation. So the thing that needed to be done is that you needed to have physical distancing, which, people say lockdown. We didn't lock down. China locked down. We definitely closed a lot of things down. So I think if you really are fair and stop the finger pointing, in the beginning, it was absolutely essential. The only way to immediately shut down the 4,000 to 5,000 deaths per day was to shut things down for a while. That was the right choice. The thing we need to re-examine is how long you did that, how long schools were closed, how long industry was shut down.
So wait, what you're sort of saying is maybe it was too long.
Maybe it was, I think,
in retrospect.
I think what people are getting confused is the idea of shutting things down temporarily was the right decision. Everyone agrees.
We all tell flatten the curve, but when the curve got flattened, we didn't get to send kids back to school.
What happened is that there became almost an ideological divide. One thing is very clear: masks work. You see a lot of people say, "Oh, masks don't work." Masks worked. The other thing that's
Well, let me push back on that a little bit too. Even those little cloth masks.
Well, again, there's the rub, Walter. A proper mask, an N95 or a KN95, properly worn all the time. If someone comes in and says, I don't know what happened. I wore a mask for most of the time. Then I went to the restaurant, I took my mask off, and I had my meal, and I got infected. Masks don't work. Well, you took the mask off. That's the problem.
Yeah, but then we had mask mandates where people had to wear these flimsy masks. You wore one that I think had the Washington Nationals sports team. I mean, and that didn't help.
Well, yeah. So that, again, is another very sensitive problem that all of us who are involved, first of all, we've got to be humble about the fact that the public health community did not do everything correct. And you wouldn't expect everyone to do everything correct when you're dealing with an emergency the likes of which we hadn't seen in over 100 years. People were dying, and everyone was trying to save lives. There was no, nefarious attempt. I think I'll shut things down because I want to ruin the economy. It's, I want to save lives. That was what happened. The lesson learned, without finger pointing, is to what extent, and it's very interesting because given the tone of the country, we need to examine again the whole issue of what a mandate is, because mandates worked very well in schools for decades and decades. In order to get your child in school, you had to be vaccinated with measles, mumps, rubella, polio. What that did was essentially eliminate these terrible diseases from our children. So it does work, but given the divisiveness in the country, understandably, and we need to re-examine it. I'm totally open to re-examine that. The idea about mandating something, if done in a very, heavy-handed way, could have the negative consequence of turning a lot of people off. We just need to examine whether that was the right thing. I don't know whether it was, but we need to examine it.
Yeah, it's hard to in this political climb, you're right. I saw you met with Robert Gary, one of our great Tulane professors, who was early on in trying to figure out the origins and was on that paper, Proximate Causes, which said that most of the available evidence really pointed to that it was a natural transmission in a wet market in Wuhan. And I read that paper and believed it, but my views have changed over the past 2 years. Just as I read more and more, and that I assume is the way science is supposed to work, but I've gone down the rabbit hole of furin cleavage sites and everything else. Have your views changed or moderated on where it came from?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's just go step by step briefly and succinctly. First of all, we don't know definitively where it came from, okay? So when you don't know definitively, people who say it's a slam dunk, it's this, it's a slam dunk, is that, that's not appropriate because we don't know. But then as a scientist, I can say, even though one or the other, a lab leak versus a natural occurrence, are the two possibilities, that as a scientist, even though both are possible, they are not necessarily equally probable. So then you say to yourself, let's look at data. And what are the data for a lab leak? There are none. There's the proposal that it could be, but what are the scientific...
Well, I mean, there is some, if you look at the structure of that virus...
No. That could easily have naturally occurred, as our Bob Gary has so elegantly written. So I'm talking about data to say it was. Then you look at the data on the other side. The very elegant work that was done by Bob and by Christian Anderson and by Mike Warraby and by Eddie Holmes, looking at the possibility, and they're humble about it. They say, we don't know definitively where it came from, but the data are accumulating rather strongly that just like 75 to 80% of all of the new infections to humanity evolved as a natural occurrence from an animal reservoir. They say we don't know for sure that that's the case, but the data lean towards that being much more probable than a lab leak. Having said that, I, for one, and Bob, I just spoke to him a little bit ago, and all of my colleagues feel we have to keep an open mind, and that when enough data solidifies one, then as scientists, we'll embrace that.
But do you see the data coming in now in terms of...
But Walter, I love you, but there's no data coming in.
Well, part of the no data coming in is we've never found any animal
Right.
that could have been the bridge animal.
But I realize that, but when people say, more and more people are now starting to say that it turned into be a lab leak. Based on what? There's no new data. That's the point.
Instead of debating you on that, tell me the other side. I mean, you know that as you keep looking at it, don't you see some signs
No.
at the Wuhan lab?
No. The answer is if you see, what we need to do is to not have Walter Isaacson or Tony Fauci or everybody who's on TikTok analyzing that. You need to get the evolutionary virologists who really understand that, who almost uniformly say it is compatible with natural.
It's compatible.
Yeah.
But Zineb Tucheki, is that how you say the name? And others who have changed their minds, that doesn't...
Well, again, Walter, you can change your mind based on what? We had a new CIA director come in and says, I've changed my mind, I think it's a lab leak. But based on what? What new data did you see that we didn't see?
Do you wish that the Chinese had given you more data?
Oh,
then?
of course. If the Chinese had been much more open about it, they would have allowed investigators to go into the market and look, and instead of just cleaning it up so that all the data and all the evidence were gone, I think we would have been much further towards understanding where it came from. Again, bottom line, I didn't mean to be, pushing back on you, but we have to keep an open mind. I have a totally open mind about what it was. Totally open mind. When I see data that confirms one, I will embrace that.
You also... There's a sense, especially of causing this backlash, that some voices were tamped down, let's say, not censored, but even Jay Bhattacharya, who's now going to come in to be the whatever it is in the administration.
NIH director.
NIH director, it's Collins' job, yeah. He said that his Great Barrington Declaration saying, hey, let's not be so strong on shutting down things, that people kept trying to censor it on Twitter and stuff. Will we be better off to have an open debate on that?
I don't know who was trying to censor. The only thing that I can do is speak for myself. I just said I disagree with it. I didn't say censor it. I thought it was conceptually and practically flawed. And most of the epidemiologists I know agree with me. It was never an idea of trying to censor anybody. It was a question, we disagreed. We disagree with the premise that how do you sequester all the vulnerable people? What do you do with multi-generational homes? It's the assumption that the only vulnerable people are the people in nursing homes. 30% of the population is obese. They're vulnerable. 12 to 15 to 20 million people have immune compromise. They're vulnerable. What are you going to do? Put them all in camps to segregate them away? You can't do that. And then it was based on the premise that ultimately would develop herd immunity so you could let it rip through the population and then everyone would be protected. Well, it's been absolutely proven that herd immunity is not applicable to COVID. Why? I got infected 3 times already. Where does herd immunity come in?
Right. Your chapter on Donald Trump has a title, He Loves Me Not. Explain the evolution of that relationship. And when you did that wonderful gesture like that, I think you did it at a press conference when he was telling people to inject bleach or something. Remind me what you were thinking in those times.
Well, that gets pretty gobbled by people who are weaponizing this issue with my relationship when I was in the White House with President Trump. First things first, I have a great deal of respect for the office of Presidency of the United States. I always have. Number 2, that when the president was saying things that were uncomfortable for me, like when he was overtly criticizing members of the press who I knew and were friends with, I didn't like that. But I didn't say anything about it. I'm a physician, a scientist, and a public health official. But when he started to say things that were public health-wise and scientifically incorrect, I felt in order to preserve my personal integrity and my responsibility to the American public, I had to publicly disagree with him. And when he said, it's going to disappear like magic in April, I could understand why he said that. And I had no ill feeling towards him when he said that. But it was incorrect. It wasn't going to disappear. So the American public, I had to tell them when a press person would ask me up on the podium, do you agree that it's going to disappear like magic? I had to say no. And then when it was obvious that it wasn't going to disappear like magic, he started to evoke magic elixirs like, hydroxychloroquine is going to come in and it's going to cure everybody. So the press would then put the microphone in front of me. Is hydroxychloroquine going to be the end all of COVID? And I have to say, no, I'm very sorry. I disagree. Hydroxychloroquine, there's no evidence that it works. And in fact, it can do harm if it's misused. That generated a degree of hostility and attempts to discredit me, not necessarily so much on the president's part. He just wanted me to be more positive about things. And I would tell him that I am being positive by telling the American public the truth. But what it generated in the White House, particularly among the comms people, was an attempt to discredit me and saying, well, Peter Navarro wrote that editorial in USA Today saying everything that Fauci says is wrong, coming from a guy who I don't think he has a lot of scientific training. But nonetheless, he said that, and that attempt at discrediting prevails to this day. So again, it was not comfortable. The people who try to create this split between me and the president when I was there don't realize that I had no ill will whatsoever towards the president. I just felt a responsibility to tell the truth to the American public.
Why don't more people do that?
You know, they're afraid of the consequences, I think.
You have a bodyguard.
Yeah, right. So, in the memoir, Walter, it's clear that I said in the very beginning, one of the things that has stuck with me over the years is that the first time I was getting ready to brief President Reagan about HIV, and of note, the president did not mention the word AIDS until the second year of his second term. A friend of mine who actually spent several years in the Nixon White House gave me a bit of advice that I would have hoped I would have felt this way even without his advice, but his advice was helpful. He told me, whenever you go into the White House and go under that awning of the West Wing lower level to go into the White House, whisper into your own ear, this may be the last time I'm going to go into this building, because I may have to tell the president or the vice president or his people an inconvenient truth that would get them to shoot the messenger. And when you go, you ask anybody that's been in the White House, it's an awesome place. You go in and you say, oh my God, here's where Abraham Lincoln was, here with Teddy Roosevelt, and here's where Franklin Roosevelt were. You really want to get asked back. So there is a temptation that you might tell people something that they want to hear as opposed to the inconvenient truth. And I did that through the 7 presidents that I had the privilege to advise. But the time came during that time when I had to evoke that, it's nice here, but I have to get in front of the microphone and say, no, it's not going to disappear like magic, and no, hydroxychloroquine is not going to be the answer. And you're absolutely correct. That cost me, but it was worth it. I would do it over again.
let me take a specific example of that, beautiful, in your memoir, is when you had to tell the president, no, we may need booster shots. And he got really mad, right?
Really mad.
Okay.
Well, again, the theme was, Tony, why can't you be more positive and give a positive message? So, if a message is positive, I'll give a positive message, but there's also the reality. And as Walter was alluding to, the time came when the vaccines were getting ready to be unfolded on the public. This was right towards the end of his presidency. And people were asking me what I thought about this. And in most vaccines, particularly when we know coronavirus immunity is not long lasting, we know that because we have experience with the common cold coronaviruses, that you can get infected and then 8 months, a year later, you can get reinfected, which is proof positive that immunity doesn't last forever. Unlike measles, if you get infected or vaccinated with a vaccine for measles, your immunity is minimally measured in decades and maximally measured for a lifetime. That's not the case with COVID. So when the vaccines were getting ready to be rolled out, the press were asking me, is this going to be the end of COVID? And I said, well, in some respects, yes, but it is likely that we may need a booster after a certain number of months. He didn't like that. So he got very upset. And that was part of the love me not. He called me up in the middle of the night and started yelling at me, telling me, why can't you be more positive? Why can't you be more positive?
Stock market.
What?
Stock market.
Well, I don't know. Yeah.
No. He said that the stock market should have gone up more, and he blamed you, right?
Well, as I said, he used very colorful language, which I won't use here. But he said the stock market only went up 500 points when the idea about a vaccine coming out. You come out and talk about a booster, it should have gone up 5,000 points. You've lost me $1 trillion. And I said, excuse me? All I did was say that we needed a booster.
You just spoke of measles and what great things a vaccine did. I actually went and got an MMR shot. I love vaccines. Every time, whenever I ride by Walgreens on Magazine Street, I just start rolling up my sleeves. Give me a book. So I got the MMR. But tell us about these childhood vaccines. They become so part of the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. controversy. And one thought is, clearly the vaccines are safe on their own. But have we started a process where so many vaccines are being given that there might be some cumulative danger?
Well, again, the point that Walter's making is that the people who are against giving children a significant number of vaccines is saying that antigenic stimulus, that load of giving vaccines multiple at a time, is going to overwhelm the immune system and cause a negative effect on the child. Well, first of all, there's absolutely no evidence that occurs. But there's other evidence that strongly suspects that will not happen. And that is, if you get one infection of a real pathogen, which each pathogen has dozens, if not hundreds, of antigens in them, the amount of stimulus you would get in your immune system from one infection far exceeds the amount of antigens that get put into you with multiple vaccinations. So even though there's no evidence that antigen overload occurs, the practical experience of getting infected and recovering from infection and doing really fine, that happens to children every single day. So, I have 3 daughters. When they were babies, they used to get infected, and you could see them crying in the crib, they have a fever, etc. That pathogen is replicating in them until their immune system suppresses it. That amount of antigenic stimulus is more than all the vaccines that I gave my child.
But you and I, and then I guess your children too, we were born, may I say, early enough that we didn't have the vaccine, so we all got measles, we all got mumps, rubella. Is there something to be said for that natural immunity?
Not when you have a disease like measles, which historically has killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people throughout
So
the
how
world.
dangerous do you think it is? I think Texas is doing it, whatever, saying you don't have to get these vaccines. How dangerous?
That is incorrect by all parameters of experience and science.
Dangerous?
Measles, although most people recover from measles, that doesn't take away from the fact that 1 in 20 people who get it get hospitalized, 1 to 3 per thousand get a central nervous system that could lead to death. So don't get fooled by the fact that most people recover well from something. Therefore, you shouldn't protect against it because you're forgetting that a certain percentage die. So back in 1979 to 81, there was a big dip in vaccinations for measles. There was about 55,000 cases of measles in the United States and an estimated 160 deaths during that period of time. Are we willing to accept death from a preventable disease among our children? No, not at all.
Absolutely. I know it's not an infectious disease, but why do you think, or do you think it's true that there's been a rise of autism?
You know, again, I'm not an autism expert, so I rely on the experts in this. And rather than an increase in autism, has been an increase in what the definition of the broader spectrum of things that would never cause autism now cause autism. So there's no indication at all of an increase, even though there are a lot of people that say it is. Again, this is what the experts in the field say. This is not my area.
What about the cutbacks that are happening now? Not, let's put aside the National Institutes of Health grants to universities, but the things that are happening in the federal government in the past few weeks. What do you see the most danger?
Well, I think there's a lack of appreciation that when you cut back on something, and we've seen a lot of this, cut back and, oops, no, I didn't mean that, put them back. You can't really do that because when you interfere with the flow of something, it could have consequences that you will not be able to correct for a significant period of time. I mean, the idea that drugs that go out, particularly to the developing world and sub-Saharan Africa and other regions that are underserved, that go out via the PEPFAR program through USAID, that you can interfere with that for a period of time and then reconstitute it or even cut it off indefinitely, you're talking about lives that are going to be lost. This isn't a company that you think is bloated. So you say, we're going to cut 30% of it and hopefully we'll have greater efficiencies and then we'll do better in the long run. When you cut off the flow of life-saving drugs to people, people die. That's not the same as restructuring a company to make it financially more feasible to get ahead. Its lives are at stake. That's what troubles me and so many of my colleagues.
The bigger issue that your book talks about, whatever, is a surprising, after 500 years, shift into a lack of belief in the scientific method and in science. Tell me what you see happening there and what we can do to push back on that.
Well, there are some immediate things to do, is to try and make sure that, the people who, it just seems to me that from the input that I'm getting is that the people who are anti-science and anti-vax are very energetic. They use social media, and they're out there all the time doing this. And I get asked by academic institutions, what can we do? Well, it seems that the people who do that invest so much energy and time. You question, do they really have day jobs, or is that all that they do? So the people who are making statements based on evidence and data need to be more proactive about that. The other thing is that I think we need to concentrate in our educational system on a greater degree of science literacy and a greater degree of critical thinking, because critical thinking means critical thinking is you don't accept something because you saw it on social media. You ask yourself the question, what is the basis of this statement? Is there any truth to that? We don't see that very much right now. We just people that if you see, we know this, and history says how dangerous this is, that if you say an untruth enough and spread it enough over and over and over again, it becomes true to a substantial segment of the population. And I think that's what we're seeing now with the disinformation, that we didn't have social media, decades ago, where something gets on, it goes viral and over and over and over again, and people say, oh yeah, I saw that, I heard that on TikTok, it must be true. That is a lack of critical thinking.
What keeps you up at night about the next thing that might hit us?
Yeah, well, for the previous 45 years prior to COVID, people would ask me as an infectious disease person, what is your worst nightmare and what keeps you up at night? And I would say consistently, the evolution of a brand new disease, likely jumping from an animal reservoir, and you could go back and look at that on YouTube. I said that decades ago. Respiratory borne with a high degree of transmissibility, with a significant degree of morbidity and mortality. That's what I would say. And sure enough, in 2020, the end of 2019, my worst nightmare came true. My answer to your question, Walter, is the same as it was 10 years ago, is that there are a lot of diseases that emerge, but the nature of the disease is not amenable to widespread throughout the globe. Like Ebola is a very serious disease. It never will be a major pandemic because the mode of transmissibility, so you have to have direct contact with the bodily fluids of a very sick person, who unlikely is going to go on an airplane or in an elevator. They likely will be in bed. And that's the reason why the people who get infected with Ebola are family members, healthcare providers, and morticians. So, however, what is likely to happen, I don't know if it's going to be next year or 10 years or 15 or 20 years from now, is the emergence of another respiratory disease. It may be another coronavirus, because we know that coronaviruses really, mostly in bats, have the capability of binding to receptors that are in humans. It could be another flu. We're dealing with H5N1 now, which is bird flu, which has taken the somewhat disturbing step of infecting mammals, namely cows and cats and other mammals, which means it's adapting itself more to a human. So my concern, Walter, is that whenever that happens, the next outbreak will be of a respiratory disease that's easily transmissible, that has a significant degree of morbidity and mortality.
And we are making this a little bit more dangerous with the cuts and our attitude toward science?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're removing the pandemic preparedness and response programs that we put in place, 5 or 6 years ago.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, thank you for all you do, and thank you for being with us.